Good morning, good evening, whoever you are, wherever you are, whatever you might be doing. We wish to welcome you to the Silverlight Show. The Silverlight shines to illuminate that which lies hidden in darkness. For those of you tuning in today, we welcome you in. This is a huge topic, so I might split it into a series. But let's check down the rabbit hole and see what we find out. We're getting a lot of people talking about end stage capitalism. The idea that the system as we know it now is not going to last forever and it's going to break down. This is for a lot of reasons. Some people posit that there's going to be a revolt. Others think that our very economic system is sabotaged and it's going to collapse under its own weight. I don't think there's a rebellion happening. There's just enough bread and circuses to keep people happy. And well, let's be honest, there's still a pretty big inflow of immigrants who see this as the promised land. And there's a lot of benefits to being a citizen of any of the nations in North America. As far as economic collapse goes, the idea is we're essentially doing what 1920s Germany did and printing money with nothing to back it. Now there is some validity to this concept. It completely misunderstands the value of trade deficits, trade goods, and how exactly a dollar is printed. That would be a hell of an episode to go into, so I'm just going to skim over it for now. But a useful instruction for what might happen in the event of a societal collapse in the Western educated, industrialized, rich, democratic world was the collapse of the Soviet Union. And I'm old enough, I was there when it was happening. As a matter of fact, I was in the armed forces while it was happening. And it was a real mentality shift. One that I'd say I haven't recovered from because on occasion I still call the people that live in the geographic bounds of Russia Soviets. It's hard for me to get over because of my formative years that was a thing. The Soviets were no laughing matter. We were being told the Russians were preparing to invade. They had so many more nukes than we did, and the fear was palpable. The US was still stinging from not being able to rule the rocket race from above. And indeed, the Russians had some pretty ambitious projects up their sleeves. The Soviet Buran shuttle. In every single way, it was better than the United States shuttle. Of course, it was designed almost 20 years afterwards, so you would hope they would do a better job of it. Learning from the mistakes, figuring things out, and it was under testing when the Soviet Union collapsed. But, like I said, after an additional 20 years of designing things, you kind of expect that. So what happened? In 1985, if you had gone to Red Square, you would have seen pretty much the same thing you would have seen in 1995, except 1995 was worse. In the Western world, the exact opposite happened. If you're in Washington, D.C. in 1985, you would have looked across to see the Capitol, and you would have turned 180 degrees and seen the homeless shelter in front of it. And in 1995, you would have seen the Capitol, and you turned 180 degrees and seen the homeless people behind it, except they were wearing more Nike branded stuff. Not because they were more prosperous, but because people were throwing that out and donating it. So there was signs of improvement in the Western world that the Eastern world simply didn't get. So what happened? Gorbachev happened. Now Gorbachev had to happen. I'm going to call them the Russians this time. The Russians had intense reverence for anybody who went through primarily the October Revolution. And in the 1980s, remember the Great Revolution happened in 1917. So if you allow those people to be about 20 years old when this is happening, by the 80s, these people are in their 80s or 90s. And they'd had a revolving door of premieres. I remember the one before Gorbachev, and I apologize for not looking it up. He was in there a matter of days, maybe weeks, and he passed on simply because he was too old. Tragic, but they were running out of those original visionaries, the ones who were marching down singing, "Will you join in our parade? Who will be strong and stand with me?" Yeah, I know, Les Mis doesn't really apply to Soviet Russia. But the point is, they relied on that bulwark for so long, they forgot to innovate. They forgot to look at their institutions and say, we need to look at a new way to do things. Remember, it was called the Soviet Union, not the Russian Union, not this, well, it was called the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. And that idea comes from the Soviet. Now, the Soviet is about as close to socialism that the USSR ever got. What were Soviets? Well, Soviets were basically councils, and they were everywhere. You know how people over here complain about HOAs? Well, Soviets were much the same way. Because you would have one of these people from the Great Revolution, perhaps the Great Patriotic War, what we know as World War II, and they'd be sitting on these boards and they'd monopolize them, they'd get their friends around them, and they would dictate what happened. And much like an HOA, once you got your seat on the Soviet, you were set for life. You would have a salary, because yes, rubles did exist. You would have first pick of a lot of things that came in, and it was a very unbalanced system. The Soviets really invested heavily in the bread and circuses programs. There were athletic divisions coming out the wazoo. One of the reasons the Soviets were so good at hockey is because they had so many minor league teams. Like even Canada can't compete with that amount of talent in the system. And all these minor league teams, everybody was being paid. So you could have a 50-year-old guy who all he'd done all of his life was play hockey, and he was no longer the star he was during his youth, but he was still getting a salary of some sort. That's because the local Soviet had decided they needed 4 hockey teams, and this 50-year-old who would probably be in pretty good shape because he's paid to be in shape all day, was required to fill out one of those 4 teams, and there was nobody that could come along and replace him. Do you notice a recurring theme here? Nobody could replace him. This is because when the Great Revolution of 1917 happened, they were suddenly in uncharted territory. The Tsar was gone, and they really didn't have anybody to replace him. So humans did what humans always do. They find a bunch of old people who seem to remember how things worked, and they use them. This is not unique to Russia. This is throughout the entire world. Generally, when you get a small tribe or something, the chief is one of the older people, or the wise man is one of the older people. So either the guy in charge is an older fellow, or the guy advising him is an older fellow. I say older fellow, on occasion it is a woman, but unfortunately as a species we're not really egalitarian yet. I will concede that point to the feminists. We're getting better, but where we're going to see the most gains is not where we're attacking. Back to the Soviet Union. So the Soviets were able to do one thing very well. That is control things. Lenin was trying to adhere to his socialist ideology, but he recognized he couldn't just take a whole bunch of farmers, throw them into cities and say, "Good news, comrades, you are free." And unfortunately, he died so soon after the revolution that Stalin took over, and the revolution had already established itself as authoritarian. Not socialist, authoritarian. Had the trappings of socialism, but essentially Stalin or any of the premiers after him could simply walk into your local city block and say, move all these people, put up apartment buildings, or move all these people, we're building a factory. There was nothing you could do. Say what you will about our Western, educated, industrialized, rich, democratic society, but at least you have redresses. You can sue, you can appeal, you can go to your local government. But in their case, they just told the local Soviet, this is what you're doing. And if you don't agree with this, we have these men in uniforms that will explain it to you. And that's where the Soviet Union really met its downfall, right from its inception. When we get into the 80s, and these old people are doddering old fools, and they've done the best they can, because I do believe they all tried their hardest. Not always to do what was right, but to do what they thought was right. In the 80s, that stuff no longer flew. Radio stations were able to get further inside, and evil things were coming across, like rock and roll and jazz music. Yeah, rock and roll and jazz. Ooh, insidious Western propaganda. The news, uncensored. Yeah, we used to be able to look at TASS and say, this good news is we know this is not what's happening. And now we read TASS and saying, hey, we know it's not what's happening, but at least, we can consistently say this is not what's happening, whereas our news stations pretty much run with anything that'll get some views. When the Soviet Union collapsed, it, it was partially because Gorbachev tried to open the system up a little too quickly. And the Chinese took note of what happened. They've partially opened their country, but a lot of it is still under their direct control. And it's going to suck for the citizens that live there. Let's get that out of the way right away. But you know what? It's also a blessing in disguise, because those people don't have to go through the 10 years of hell the Russians went through. So what happened when the Soviets fell apart? As in the actual councils, not that, well, and at a greater extent the overall Soviets, because one Soviet would report to the one above it. Well, things kind of just stopped working. But you know what? People still went to work because they knew what their jobs were. If you were a bus driver, you went to work, you drove your bus, and at the end of the day, you might get paid, you might not. But you still knew that you needed to do that. This is an idea that's completely absent in the Western world. And I've seen this. Bank snafu, whatever the case is. Now we have instant banking especially, and even before when you could go to an ATM, if people aren't getting paid on the day that they're supposed to get paid, you get a riot. You have to coax people, get them to come in. Now, I'm not saying the Russians were better than us at that, but they were duty bound. I don't think you would get that in the Western world. If everybody stopped getting paid, it would be chaos. But I think eventually people would start coming back because there's not many ways to make money. The average Russian citizen, remember, this is after the revolution, so they've gone from being Soviets to being Russians. Not much really changed, to be honest. There's still long lineups for bread. There's still long lineups to get the latest TV. And you're pretty much self-sufficient. But they've been self-sufficient for a long time. I've mentioned this before. It's really not hard to start up a kitchen garden. Get yourself a nice place where a lot of light comes in. You can get those little, what do you call them, seed starter packs. And before you know it, you got a big bunch of rosemary. You got a big bunch of thyme, carrots. My cousins grow potatoes in those big burlap sacks. It's apparently pretty easy. Don't know, that's something I keep meaning to check into, but imagine if you are a Russian in the 80s to the 90s. The only food you have is what you're growing because The stores are out of their stores are out of stock, and everything's too expensive anyway. So that's one of the reasons I know our system works. Not everything is out of stock. Money buys less and less, but they still manage to bring stock in. The Russians didn't have that advantage, but they knew the old ways. The old people that survived had taught them very well. Hey, keep these sacks of potatoes growing, and you're going to get a couple meals out of it. If you ever watch Russian cooking, it's very heavy on things like mayonnaise. Mayonnaise is made from eggs. And it is possible to keep chickens. I don't personally do it, but it is possible to have your own little chicken coop. And once you get some potatoes and mayonnaise, you're almost all the way to a Russian potato salad. And I'm sure there's better uses of your resources than that. So, all in all, the system collapsed mostly because it was run by older people who didn't know how to respond to the 20th century ending. Systems were basically left behind, no innovations had happened, nothing was modernized, and it wasn't just the Soviet leadership that was crumbling, but everything was crumbling around them. Now, if you'd asked anybody in 1985, when's the Soviet Union going to collapse? Never. The best example of this is in the movie 2001 and 2010. 2010 was released in the early 80s, I believe, and there the Soviet Union was launching a probe to Jupiter in 2010. And there's a nuclear standoff in the middle of this movie because nobody thought that was going to change. The Soviets looked strong. It looked like they weren't going anywhere, and I dare say that most of their citizens believed the same. Unfortunately, reality played a completely different part. Just start going through 1980s movies. Was it Rocky IV where he takes off Drago from the Soviet Union? Yeah. So it's the Cold War. People just thought it was going to go forever. Things like the Battletech universe. They had a backstory that reached from 3000 back to 2000s, and they did predict there would be a Soviet revolution sometime around 2020. Well, they hit the mark a hell of a lot better than most other people were writing at that time. Mac Maloney had a series called Wingman. It was entirely based around the idea that there was a conventional war fought in Europe, and the Russians managed to get a sneak attack in on the Americans and occupied the United States. Red Dawn, the movie. The Soviets again managed to make a sneak attack and get into the United States. It was that paranoia that fueled the arms race. And you know what? We still suffer the same paranoia. It's just transferred. You see, with the Ukrainian invasion, the Russians can still stand in as the bad guys. But we've been trained to transfer that fear over to terrorists, over the person who's next to us. And it's the same fear. Oh, society's going to hell. The guy next to me could stab me tomorrow. My neighbors could, set fire to my house. I got to put cameras up all over. I do actually recommend putting cameras up. I shouldn't make fun of that. But the important thing is we have never figured out how to have a good society without that paranoia. So what do we need to do? Keep on innovating. And I don't just mean Elon Musk and whatever his latest project is. We need to keep innovating. Learning to say, my next door neighbor is not my enemy. Learning to say, hey, that stranger down the street, he seems like an okay guy. He's just walking along, listening to his music, having a good day. Rather than, ooh, that stranger, he's spooky. Or she's spooky. Hey, I've seen enough court videos to know that anybody anywhere could be that person. So the Soviet Union was a very interesting case. But ultimately, it's an instructive case. We can't let these old people stay in power forever. And I say that because we got an election coming up where two over 70s are arguing over who's going to get to be the president. So this might be a good time to take a look back and say, term limits are not such a bad idea, and maybe we should have a cap somewhere where you can serve your first term. Yes, you get some people who serve into their 90s, but most of them at that time should be retired on a golf course and enjoying whatever the heck it is they do with their life. With that, we hope you enjoyed this episode of the Silverlight Show. If you did, please hit the like button, subscribe, always interruptions. Don't forget to, and you know what, there's a spam called too. Please hit the like button, subscribe if you haven't subscribed already. Don't forget to click the bell notification down in the comments, because that way you'll be notified every time there's a new show. And we hope you have a fantastic day.